Law, Immigration, and Travel. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. And so our next speaker is Nadine Idirmana Singhi, and she's from Idirmana Law. She'll be speaking to some of the legal issues surrounding vaccines, immigration, and travel. And so I'll ask Nadine to turn her camera on now so that we might see her as I read her biography. So Nadine has a wide range of experience in immigration and refugee law. She has undertaken legal research for the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers, CARL, and the Refugee Forum. She served as a legal officer and consultant at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, in Ottawa, and she volunteers her time serving different organizations, different immigrant serving organizations such as OCISO, the Ottawa Community Immigrant Services Organization, and she also volunteers her time with Immigrant Women's Services of Ottawa, IWSO. She's taught courses in immigration and refugee law at Herzing College. She has provided legal services at one of the largest immigration law firms in the country, at a legal clinic in Ottawa, and most recently as a sole practitioner for Idirmana Law. She has appeared at all four divisions of the Immigration and Refugee Board and the Federal Court of Canada to help clients with a wide range of immigration and refugee applications. I just want to add that she's also one of the lawyers that I frequently talk to and pick her brain about what can be done to serve our vulnerable clients at Connecting Ottawa. So welcome, Nadine, and thank you for being here today. And so we will be forwarding the slides. So please pay attention to the presentation and don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A box. Nadine, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you for inviting me to speak on this really interesting and timely and quickly developing topic. I am very much looking forward to it. Next slide. My goal today is to provide some information so we can think about and envision what a COVID passport regime might look like in Canada. And in doing so, the presentation is going to look at other examples in the world. So I've chosen 6 situations that we're going to look at, 3 where they have been implemented or rolled out or starting to anyhow, and 3 that are proposed. And I've chosen those 3 that are proposed as examples that we may fall in line with. And then also I wanted to look at possible issues that such a regime, a COVID passport regime, might pose. So in particular, Canadian federalism and the many jurisdictions that exist in Canada and the many different approaches as a result of that. Privacy concerns, a big topic, concerns regarding fraud, equity concerns, and reasonable alternatives. Next slide. So before we started, I wanted to issue a fun fact that I am actually the recipient of one of the first types of vaccine passports in the world. And my guess is that your clients probably are too. Next slide. What am I talking about? I'm talking about my smallpox scar. Next slide. The height of the smallpox epidemic, the scars that people got from the vaccines were used to facilitate access and mobility. So in the bottom left there, it's an example where people would show their scars to access certain venues, such as, movie theaters and other many things that we're discussing, in right now. And then in the top right, that is actually a picture of individuals who are waiting for immigration examination on Ellis Island. And there is documentation that those individuals would be asked to show their vaccine markings in order to confirm that they did get the vaccine and that they weren't going to be passing it on when they came into the country. So next slide. What are vaccine passports? So a vaccine passport is proof that one has tested negative or been protected against certain infections. So it can be digital, like a phone app, or physical, like a small paper, or even a scar, like the example that I just gave. The picture on the right-hand side there is the yellow fever card. And it is often needed in subtropical parts of Africa and South America. And many of you may have gotten it or have one yourself when you've been traveling. Yellow fever is one of the few vaccine, it's the only one actually that's regulated by the WHO, where this card is standardized by the WHO as a way to facilitate different states being on the same page in terms of what is required to evidence that a person does have their shot. Next slide, please. So what would these vaccine passports be used for? I do think that it is important to start by looking at that. And I've identified 3 here. The first is to access various domestic facilities. So that's the gentleman on the bottom picture. Remember them? Again, to access various facilities, restaurants, movie theaters, concerts, gyms, etc. The next 2 relate to international travel. So individuals who are coming to Canada may be required to show a vaccine passport, but also if a Canadian was to travel elsewhere, we may be required, according to the rules of the given country, to show a vaccine passport as well. And I would add to that a 4th one that I was thinking of actually last night, which would be potentially interprovincial travel. So I could envision a situation where maybe if someone is going between provinces, that they may be asked to show that they have a vaccine passport as well. So why have I made this distinction? I've made this distinction because I think that the ease, of securing a vaccine passport, the requirements of a particular passport may vary in each one of those situations. And for the purposes of the presentation today, I'm going to be looking at the second of those. So what type of system might be in place when an individual comes to Canada? But in doing that, I'm going to look at some examples of the first. So where countries have instituted some sort of vaccine passport within their borders, because it's a good, case study for how that might be exported to elsewhere in the world. Next slide, please. So the World Health Organization does not recommend at this point introducing COVID-19 vaccine passports because of 2 main considerations. So the first is scientific considerations. So we've had an excellent presentation explaining how effective all the vaccines are in protecting individuals who've received the vaccine against infection, but also serious, infection and hospitalization. But there is limited evidence on whether or not vaccinated people can transmit COVID-19 to others. And so obviously, if you were vaccinated, but you're still able to pass it on, then, maybe it wouldn't make sense to require a COVID passport. It's not that they necessarily are transmitting the disease, it's just that the science isn't very clear on that particular point. There's 2 other variables or unknowns at this point that I've added. The second is, and they're both were discussed this morning. The second is that we don't know yet for sure how long immunity will last. And it does seem like increasingly the consensus is that we're going to require a booster shot. And that, I read yesterday that it seems that it may be a situation where we might even require yearly shots like the flu shot. And the last of those is we don't know how well each vaccine is going to work against the different variants, not just the existing ones, but also ones that may arise in the future. So there are still a lot of scientific variables. The data isn't yet clear on. The second consideration is ethical considerations. And that is the concern that the WHO has that if individuals are going to be getting vaccine passports and there will be a greater demand for vaccines from those individuals, then it may restrict the availability of vaccines globally. In other countries who may be much further behind in terms of getting their populations vaccinated will not be able to have access to those really important resources. So I wanted to take a minute to note that the World Health Organization has the authority internationally to oversee vaccination requirements for international travel. and also what constitutes proof of vaccination. So as I noted, yellow fever is the only disease that they currently, well, let me take a step back. It's the international health regulations that gives them this authority. And in those regulations, yellow fever is identified as the only disease where countries can require proof of vaccination for international travel. However, the WHO does issue temporary recommendations every 3 months, allowing certain countries to require proof of polio vaccinations for international travel. And I thought that that was an important distinction in terms of the emerging science around COVID-19 and where COVID passports may fall in this particular regime that's outlined in the international health regulations. It may be that it's something that is examined on a more regular basis, like polio, and requirements are changed, given that everything is moving so quickly. The WHO has also started a smart vaccination certificate working group, and they are examining the question of how a COVID passport may look. Their mandate is, and I quote, to inform the development of specifications and guidance for using digital technologies for documenting vaccination status. So those yellow fever health cards, there have been increasingly concerns with fraud surrounding those. And so obviously technology is not immune to that issue or that problem. And so this working group is trying to work towards a solution. So although the WHO is not currently recommending COVID passports, and although really they're the ones who have the authority to sanction those, there are still countries who are moving ahead in looking at what they might want to see in a COVID passport, and also instituting passports, as I noted, for different purposes. And I think that, states are just moving to get ahead of this. There have been some concerns with previous WHO recommendations, and so states are trying to get ahead of what may be required and advisable as the science emerges. Next slide, please. So I thought I would take a minute to outline the current requirements to travel to Canada. So presently, one would need to show a negative COVID-19 molecular test that's taken within 72 hours of a scheduled departure to Canada. And they would need to submit travel and quarantine plans using a system online, ArriveCan. They would need to test for COVID upon arrival at a Canadian port of entry, undertake the mandatory quarantine period, test for COVID at the end of their quarantine period, and submit daily symptom reports while they're in quarantine. There are some limited exceptions to all of these. So for example, those under the age of 5 don't necessarily need to do all of these steps, but there are no exceptions currently made for those who are vaccinated. The point is that the system here that we have, it can be somewhat cumbersome, it's lengthy, it's costly, and so a vaccine passport would curb this and would get around this and save valuable resources. Next slide, please. So Canada has expressed its commitment towards instituting some form of COVID passport. These are quotes I've taken from our Minister of Health. That's her on the bottom right there. And she's noted that we have been undertaking conversations already, both with the G7 countries, but also with the Americans. And she notes that in those conversations, we are talking about what international travel might look like and what kinds of criteria would need to go into any kind of vaccination certification process. We're also looking at how we deal with the equity issues that will likely arise as a result of inequitable access to vaccination globally. And I thought that that was really interesting as well, that she is publicly noting that that is, a concern that they're trying to address at the front end. Next slide, please. Other considerations in implementing a COVID passport are privacy concerns, potentials for fraud and forgery, disparate access, so not just between countries, as noted by Minister Hadju in the previous slide, but also among nationals within a country. Age, gender, race, and most importantly for our conference today, language as well. And finally, varying Canadian jurisdictions and poor history, our poor history with centralizing health information. Next slide, please. So China is, I wanted to move on to look at some examples. And these first three are ones where some sort of system is being implemented. So China is the only country at present that's requiring proof of vaccination for entry. And they are processing visas only for those who can prove that they've received a Chinese-made vaccination. So it's not that those who have non-Chinese made vaccines can enter. They can still apply. They just may need stronger reasons for entry or specific documentation. So why Chinese vaccines in specific? There's lots of speculations. Some are speculating that it may be a way to get more usage of those Chinese vaccines, and also to kind of indirectly push for approval of those vaccines in other countries, because if individuals don't have those vaccinations, then they can't necessarily, or as easily anyhow, go into China. And also just vaccine nationalism. Of note, China has developed 5 vaccines and 34 countries have approved at least one of those. Next slide, please. So Israel has its own system. It's called the Green Pass. So as noted in the previous presentation, it has one of the highest, has the highest, I should note, vaccination rate in the world. More than half of the population is fully vaccinated, meaning that they've received all the shots necessary per the guidelines. The Green Pass is given to those who are vaccinated for COVID-19 or those who've recovered from COVID-19. And the pass basically links to the National Health Ministry's data and gives a scannable code that users can either print up or pull up on their phone to evidence that they have received one of those 2 vaccinations. Sorry, not vaccinations, but systems to protect themselves. And it serves as a mandatory permit to enter certain places within the country. So it restricts access if you don't have the pass. Next slide, please. The pros and cons of the system. So it's probably the furthest developed of all vaccination passport regimes in the world, and the most longest used, I guess I'll say. Although it's not used for the purposes of traveling across a border, it's used only for internal purposes. The big con is that it, in our context, for our purposes, it does seem like something that would be very difficult to implement in Canada, given our many varying provincial jurisdictions and the fact that we don't really have a central repository of health data that we can draw from in terms of trying to implement something similar or trying to, model their system. Next slide, please. The other example is the Estonian Pass. So the Estonian Pass is being piloted in Estonia, Hungary, and Iceland with the support of the WHO. It uses blockchain technology and a quick response code in order to facilitate the passport. So I didn't put it up here, but I don't know if everyone knows, that's a QR pass. You can basically download it on your mobile phone, or you can print it up. You can print up the code, and that would serve as your evidence that you've been vaccinated. So the code links back to an official data set that confirms your vaccination status. And you could in the system build an expiry date, which would basically safeguard against any new scientific data that emerges. So if, for example, it turns out that your immunity is only going to be 1 year long, and then you need additional shots, then you could build in some sort of expiry date. And I actually think the Israeli system has a automatic 6-month expiry date that's built into it. The technology facilitates a system that is easier to authenticate and that's impervious to fraud. So in saying that, I'm comparing it to more of a paper-based system, those yellow cards, which can more easily be forged. And from what I've read, it looks like the QR code is the preferred technology for dealing with those concerns regarding fraud and authenticity. there are some that have proposed that, look, it looks really good and it looks like something that would fit our needs in Canada very well, and we should just buy the technology. I want to note, it's cut off there at the top, but the WHO is supporting this initiative. And so I suspect that their working group is working closely on this as well. And so it seems to me that in whatever system that the WHO may support, that this is one that they are very, at the early stages anyhow, looking to get involved with as a way to implement it and bring up any, requirements that they put in their regulations more clearly. Next slide, please. So the European Commission is also having their own system. It's the Digital Green Certificate. And it seems, I've picked this one as well, because it seems very likely that, if something is instituted here, that we are likely to have something that is on the same page, or that, meshes very well with what's being tried there. So it is a fairly new proposal. It's not implemented. It's been proposed fairly recently, just mid last month, March 17th. And the purpose of the system would be to act as proof that a person has been vaccinated against COVID-19, that they've received a negative test result, or that they've recovered from COVID-19. The system aims to be free of charge. It is to be accessed in digital or paper format, so one could print it up if they needed to. And again, it would use a QR code to ensure security and authenticity. Next slide, please. The UK, it's not quite as robust as Israel, but still really great. Half of the residents have had at least one shot. And so I think that that's probably the second most successful rollout of the vaccination. The government is looking into the possibility of using vaccine certificates to facilitate accesses to various areas such as pubs and stadiums, but it won't be made available until all adults have had a chance to be vaccinated. And that's noted by the Prime Minister himself. And I note that because it seems that, that's likely what, if we institute something like that internally, it seems likely that Canada would do the same, that we wouldn't require those vaccination certificates to access public places until everybody has had a chance to access vaccines. Next slide, please. For obvious reasons, for reasons of equity. So the last one here is the IATA Travel Pass. And so the IATA is the International Air Transport Association, and it's an association of 290 airlines. So their goal is to have a global and standardized solution to validate and authenticate all country regulations regarding COVID-19 travel regulations. So they've got 4 main components. They've got a registry of health requirements, and that registry basically would note all the requirements in every single country for the purposes of having some sort of COVID-19 passport. The second of those is having a registry of testing or vaccination centers. That also, would be really useful. So we saw in Canada right now, you need to show that you have a negative test, or a test, I should say, within the last 72 hours. And so that would include if you were at a transit point. So being able to know where you can go to get a test and the type of test that you could get would be very useful for the purposes of those individuals who do have stopovers. The third is a lab app, and that would enable labs to securely send results and certificates to passengers. And that's, we see that in our industry all the time, when we have those medicals that our clients do. And I think those medicals too have QR codes on them. So, it's not, I think, outside of our industry to envision these things. And the last would be a travel pass app. And that would enable users to manage and submit documentation related to the COVID passport. So the big thing about this one is a bit unique than the other ones because it's, led by a private organization rather, as opposed to a country or as opposed to a group of countries. And so I would raise the question of whether or not there's a conflict of interest there. obviously, someone who is representing the airlines has an interest in facilitating travel and facilitating individuals moving across borders. And so when we're talking about balancing, efficacy and protecting the public against the need for individuals to cross borders and expediency, they have a vested interest in one versus the other. And so I don't know that they might necessarily be the best organization to deal with that. Having said that, currently there are implications for airlines if certain things, happen, and they're not adequately checking individuals who are boarding flights. So individuals, for example, who travel with fraudulent documents and who make refugee claims or something of that nature. But I do think that compared to other organizations, that they may not be, or at least that their biases need to be looked at more closely in terms of using a system that they're going to be managing. And the other issue with regards to having a private entity like this manage a system would be issues with privacy. So, I don't know whether or not individuals would feel more or less comfortable with having nowadays a government versus a private organization handling their information, but I do think it's a really important discussion that needs to be had. Next slide, please. So other ongoing attempts, obviously for time reasons, I'm not in a position to talk about every other type of system, but I do want to note that the ones that I've listed here, the ones that I've gone through, are not the only systems in the world. So other G7 nations are trying to institute their own COVID-19 passport systems. Germany in particular is one that I would flag, but also the World Economic Forum, in contrast to the IATA, the one on the previous slide, has their own pass. It's a common pass. And the IATA's travel pass was looked at as being, in competition to the common pass through the World Economic Forum. In addition to that, our neighbors to the south, they have their own approaches. It does vary considerably from state to state. However, I've put the example here of New York State. They have the Excelsior Pass, and it would basically confirm vaccination or a recent negative test. It warrants noting, if we're going to talk about what they're doing in the US, that it is taking on a bit more of a partisan tone there. And, where governments are engaging in this, discussion, private venues are taking on the task of instituting some sort of pass or some sort of system where they require a certificate, and what types of certificates they are or they aren't going to accept for the purposes of letting individuals into their facility. In addition to that, I've already noted the WHO has their Smart Vaccination Certificate Working Group, and they're seeking to outline international standards for digital vaccination certificates. And so what they note there when they do issue something is going to probably mean that other nations will have to, or will likely adjust if they've got something in place to conform to the WHO standards. And finally there, I put in the Linux Foundation's initiatives. They've got a COVID-19 credentials initiative, and it's basically an open source software where they're trying to promote individuals and entities to assist in kind of collectively coming up with a system. Next slide. So here in Canada, our lovely federalism means that we have lots of different approaches that don't necessarily speak to one another. And I thought that I would note here some of the main players in terms of what they're doing with COVID passports. So Manitoba actually is already issuing vaccine certificate cards. Ontario has promised that we will be getting documents to confirm that, but that has not yet happened, and how that is going to look is currently not clear. Quebec is looking at using its existing database of vaccine records to come up with some sort of vaccination certificate or passport. And the Alberta government maintains that it would be a violation of the Privacy Act. That's a statement from Minister Kennedy. It's still possible to proceed, with, a various kind of hodgepodge approach where each jurisdiction sets up its own way to link up to, some sort of barcode system. But, we have had issues with rolling out new technology. I read some statistics where, Canada was well below the average of developed countries in using health technology. That was in a 2019 Commonwealth Fund survey. And doctors in health regions across the country are notoriously slow on uptaking, e-health technology. So in terms of trying to figure out a system where everyone is talking to one another and on the same page, there are some experts that have raised questions on whether or not we are going to be able to effectively do that. A lot of the provinces and territories right now are working in silos. As this discussion of interprovincial travel is taking shape, however, that may change. So you may see a situation where, in Ontario, for example, we will be moving to making sure that whatever we put in place in terms of a vaccine certificate conforms or is understood with our neighbors, right? So rather than everybody, we're looking at least Manitoba and Quebec, and then moving from there. So that may change how we look at it. And, although we may not have a really amazing history with using technologies in the health sector in the past, this may be a push. So I guess I'm trying to say it's not determinative, obviously. Next slide, please. So privacy considerations. So I wanted to move on to talk about, some important things that we want to think about in terms of instituting a COVID passport regime, particularly in terms of international travel. So the question is, what are you consenting to share? And what happens when the available science changes? So at that point, are you able to change what you're consenting to share? And also, what should you be consenting to share? What's necessary to share? Where the science isn't very clear, it becomes a much more difficult question. The law is catching up to the science, and the science, until there's some answers on some big questions, I think that catch up can't really ever happen. So consider, for example, what if some vaccines have a longer efficacy period than others? What if some vaccines are better at fighting variants than others? Or moreover, what if different vaccines are better at fighting different variants? What if some of the above depends on the age of the recipient or the gender of the recipient, right? So what does that mean in terms of what information is going to be noted on a COVID passport? The type of vaccine that you've gotten, the period of time between shots, potentially, your age, your gender, and how is that information going to change, right? Based on how things develop, not just the science, but as the information on the ground, the situation on the ground changes. What variants are happening, the new variants that are coming out. I read an article today saying that the India variant was confirmed in Quebec today for the first time, and that's the one with the 2 mutants. It's not the first one in Canada, but it will potentially change or may require a different response if something like a COVID passport was put into place. Next slide, please. But all of that would vary, right? Depending on the vaccine that you had, when you got it, and so many other things. Okay, so this is something that I wanted to flag for everyone. This is a report from the Chief Science Advisor of Canada, and it is a really interesting report. It's dated the 31st of March, 2021. It's called Scientific Considerations for Using COVID-19 Vaccination Certificates. So given the short time since the COVID-19 vaccine has become available, it's not surprising that many scientific uncertainties persist and are the subject of intense ongoing studies. And so this report does flag, those questions from my previous slides as big questions that need to be answered medical information that needs more certainty, medical questions that need more certain answers or more information before kind of any system could be recommended or looked at putting in place. So the 4 things that are noted here are things we've discussed before. I've pulled these right out of the vaccination, right out of the report though. Next slide. So the retention of information, once you do put your information, or once your information is noted in some sort of system that is managing the COVID passport, is a big question. And I think the big consideration, or the big question to ask, is whether or not your trail is traceable. So Anne Kevorkian, who's Ontario's former privacy commissioner, has said that she feels that nobody should have access to an individual's vaccination status except for that person. She's noted you should be the one to control who you choose to reveal that to. So if you're at the airport, you're going to have to reveal it to the attendant, but that should be the extent of it digitally. They shouldn't retain that data, and that data shouldn't be passed on, because as science changes, how that might be used to, even mischaracterize the threat that a person might pose is a big question and a big concern, and something that needs to be looked at or thought about before a system is put into place. And next slide, please. So these are the federal legislative framework with respect to privacy. I wanted to note that the Privacy Act, which governs the federal government's collection, retention, use, and disclosure of information, does not apply to foreign nationals. It applies only to permanent residents and citizens. So when we're thinking about someone who's crossing into Canada, who's giving information with regards to their health, how that information is, retained, used, and disclosed isn't necessarily subject to the same type of rigor as opposed to a Canadian who's crossing the border. The Access to Information Act, however, would apply to foreign nationals. And there may be implications with regards to equity and with regards to any potential charter arguments. Next slide, please. The provincial legislative framework on privacy is going to vary by province. In Ontario, we have the FIPA, which is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. We also have the PIFA, which is the Personal Health Information Protection Act. And whereas immigration is a federal matter, health is in the provincial domain. So how, the type of certificate or passport that you're getting, the purposes for it, and who, is subject to what type of legislation does create a much more chaotic situation potentially. Next slide, please. And then on top of that is the charter. So not all provisions of the charter apply to non-citizens. So when we're thinking about something like mobility rights, for example, something that's been in the public discourse a lot, the ability to travel within the country applies to citizens and permanent residents, but it doesn't necessarily apply to foreign nationals. And then when we're talking about crossing into the country, that applies only to citizens. Next slide, please. I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to go through this more quickly. So fraud and forgery, the consensus seems to be that we need to implement some sort of technology, that we need to move past a paper-based system, and that it will assist in mitigating fraud. So technology, though, is not immune to fraud. And so we need to, when looking at this, balance concerns of privacy with fraud prevention. Next slide. So this is something, I think this is the last slide. This is with regards to equity considerations. So we want to think about a lot of different things in terms of creating a system that's more equitable, who has access to technology. So cell phones, computers, printers. I'm dealing with a client right now where she needs to get something printed, and that is not an easy thing to figure out right now, which I'm sure a lot of you are dealing with as well. Who has access to vaccines? Who has access to COVID testing? And these questions, not just in the context of internationally, but also domestically within a country. Next slide, please. And the last thing I wanted to note was the question of reasonable alternatives. So there are individuals who cannot be vaccinated. The situation of 16-year-olds and those with a serious medical condition are the 2 examples I put up there. But in considering those individuals, but also in the context of that kind of intense discussion in the States where it's more polarized, has been proposed that there is some prudence in offering alternatives. So examples include not just having a proof of a vaccination, but also proof of a negative test, offering on-the-spot testing, offering a regime that includes self-isolation like we have right now, or accepting documentation that a person has already recovered from COVID-19. Although I did read something saying that, you know, even if you've recovered from COVID-19, there's still a recommendation that you should be getting the shot or one of the shots. And next slide, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening and for your patience. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Nadine. So we're going to field a few questions your way. And the first one is from Alex of Connecting Ottawa. And she wants to know, how do you foresee how, you know, a vaccine passport would impact refugees fleeing their home countries?
I'm a big fan of this, you know, having some sort of reasonable alternatives in place. So, you know, the system that we have right now, it is costly, it is cumbersome, but I think that if someone is not in a position to have, those alternatives, have a passport, and we are looking at having alternatives available, how that's managed is going to be a big question. It's going to create an extra layer for refugees. So if you need to have some sort of passport in advance of getting on a plane, then that is obviously going to create an additional hurdle. And obviously, if you don't have financial resources, that's going to complicate things. If we're going to have alternatives that are available to individuals as well, how that's going to be managed by, you know, airlines, or, you know, at the point of departure as opposed to the point where you land, is also going to be a big question. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it's gonna impact refugees, but I think it's certainly going to complicate things for individuals. But you know, that's always been the case. You know, as time moves on all these additional things are put into place, it's not as easy necessarily for refugees now to cross a border as it may have been 5 or 10 or even 15 years ago.
And just following up on that and the kind of inequities, Lillian of OCISO is asking, if these countries utilize apps and digital receipt of records, how do we tackle digital inequity for those who are not tech holders and users?
Yeah, that's a big question too. So a lot of the existing systems facilitate, you know, a paper that could replace like a digital, so as opposed to just having the QR code on your phone, someone's ability to print it up. So what that means though is that you would need to access though the technology somewhere at some point. So if you don't have access to it personally, you know, are you able to access it through someone else close by? The interesting thing though is that I'm often surprised in my practice at how technology can sometimes facilitate equity in a way that I may not have anticipated. So I have clients who, you know, have cell phones in refugee camps in the most crazy places in the world, and who do have access to information in places through technology, in places that we might not think is available. So there is some sort of slow democratization that technology facilitates. Having said that, the pandemic, I think, has really ripped open inequities in society within Canada and internationally. And so whereas it may have been, or the pendulum may have been swinging one way, it may go the other way. I'm not sure, but it is a really good question.
Thanks, Nadine. And I think your final question is from Amy of OCISO. And she says, many of my clients are Chinese. For the proof of vaccines required by China for entry, does it really mean that my clients won't be able to enter the country until they have the Chinese-made vaccines? How can they get such vaccines in Canada? Can you please clarify?
So it doesn't mean that you cannot enter China if you don't have a Chinese vaccine. It just means that the process may be more onerous, It will certainly be complicated. It may take longer. You can apply, you just might need to show additional paperwork and a stronger reason for needing to enter the country. I don't think any of those Chinese vaccines are approved in Canada. I'm fairly certain they're not. There's 5 Chinese-made vaccines, and I don't think any of them are approved in Canada. How they would go about getting those, I'm not sure. It's a good question. I think generally any sort of travel now globally is much more difficult. If you are very determined, you may be able to find a way. So it may be that you travel to a jurisdiction that offers that shot, and then you're able to go from there to China. It may be that, you know, for individuals, if they are aware that they're getting that shot in China before they leave the country, so they can facilitate their re-entry back into the country more easily, or it just may mean that they have to jump through all those extra hoops if they have a vaccine, but not necessarily a Chinese-made vaccine. Having said all that, I'm not a Chinese immigration lawyer, so I should put that caveat in there and say that they should seek information from someone who may be more familiar, but also that information may change as well. So even in putting this presentation together, there's a lot that is changing almost on a not just daily, but hourly basis. And so part of the medical and legal communities kind of speaking to each other on this topic is being responsive to changes that are happening very quickly. Thanks.
Great, Nadine, that brings us to the end of your amazing presentation. Thank you so much. We know you put so much time and effort into this and into being here today. So thank you so much on behalf of Connecting Ottawa.
Thank you for
and everyone here. Okay, so we are going to take a 20-minute break.